the Joe Rogan Experience.
Are you optimistic about the future?
Yeah. I say that because it's going to take a lifetime's work, and I don't think that in our lifetime much is going to change. I think, maybe for the next generation.
What is the picture of, I mean, how do you conceive of your job at the moment, and what is the status quo? I mean, so for instance, ISIS, the Islamic State, is sort of fading from most people's memory now. I mean, there's, even mine. I'm spending much less time thinking about it because it seems to have been
so let me tell you a story.
Beaten into submission.
I can answer this question with a story. So Radical, which is my autobiography, has a US publication, right? In the UK, it's Random House Penguin. It's published by the biggest publishing house. When I came to publish in the US, I approached publishing houses, but it was after bin Laden was killed. And so when we approached 10, 20, whatever, publishing houses.
The problem solved?
They all said no. They said the problem solved. Yeah. They said, we think, we wish you'd come to us 5 years earlier, but problem solved now, and there's not a problem anymore. And a bit like what you mentioned as sort of your expertise, and I have been consumed by this subject all my life, and there are a few people on this planet that I would take seriously on this subject, outside especially of Quilliam, and there are other organizations, they have some really good people, but I know them all. And we regularly speak. So I would say to all these publishing houses, I can assure you 100% this problem not only has not been solved, is going to come back around in a far worse way than you can ever have imagined. This is before ISIS came along. None of them believed me. Of course, what then happened, my book eventually got published by some very small publishing house in the US and has done quite well for them. But the point of the story was this: ISIS came around and people were suddenly like, oh my God, where did this come from? Of course, those of us who had been monitoring the situation knew this was going to come back around very, very heavy. Now that ISIS has been pushed back, and this is where this story, sort of the point of the story is, we've got to resist the temptation to believe the problem has been solved. Because the organization known as ISIS, which is a bureaucracy, has been fought back. But the ideology upon which that organization was built is still very much alive, and it's still strong. What Al-Qaeda did, while the whole world was focused on ISIS, was exploit that opportunity to rebuild and regroup. And they've been rebuilding in Syria. Now they are stronger than they have ever been, even under bin Laden, because for the first time in the history of that organization, they are firmly embedded within the Syrian population as a genuinely kind of viewed by the people that they were fighting on behalf of as a grassroots resistance organization. Whereas before that, they were seen as a terrorist group that was like just like a vanguard. They've embedded themselves in the Syrian population, in the Yemeni civil war. They've embedded themselves in North Africa, East Africa, and in Pakistan. And they are resurgent, and they are grooming Hamza bin Laden, who is bin Laden's son, and they're grooming him for leadership. And a time will come, maybe in a couple of months, maybe in a couple of years, where they announce Hamza bin Laden as the new leader of Al-Qaeda. Currently, it's Ayman Zawahiri. When they do that, once their grooming has been complete, and assuming Hamza isn't killed up until then, all of the fragments of what remains of ISIS will probably rejoin Al-Qaeda under Hamza bin Laden, and you'll have a stronger than ever before Al-Qaeda organization. And we've got to remember that we never expected ISIS to emerge. Al-Qaeda will come back with a vengeance.
Jesus.
Yeah, what is the politics between the remnants of ISIS and Al-Qaeda?
Well, Hamza bin Laden's succession to the leadership solves that problem because the ISIS guys were originally all Al-Qaeda. ISIS was Al-Qaeda in Syria, and they broke away after bin Laden died because they had pledged allegiance to bin Laden, and the new leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman Zawahiri, is by all accounts a rather uncharismatic, and he's a pediatrician. He's not really a kind of, bin Laden had the charisma.
He's a pediatrician.
Yeah, he's Egyptian. Yeah. He's an Egyptian pediatrician from a very well-off Egyptian family, by the way.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think his grandfather was the Egyptian ambassador to the UN.
Pharmacists.
That's right. Yeah.
Super,
bin Laden clearly had the charisma, the wealth, the presence, the looks. He had all of it that Zawahiri doesn't. Zawahiri is, compared to bin Laden, he just doesn't, So if the guys that broke away from Al-Qaeda to form ISIS said to Zawahiri, the current leader, we pledged allegiance to bin Laden. We owe you nothing. You're not our Amir, our leader. If Hamza bin Laden comes back as the leader of Al-Qaeda, it solves that problem because those remnants of ISIS have a loyalty to the bin Laden name and the bin Laden family, and they remember what they consider their glory days fighting under bin Laden.
Yeah. Well,
That's not nice to hear.
That's no good.
No, the problem has not gone away. I can tell you that. The problem, and you know, the problem is the ideology, and it will not be dealt with until we deal with this ideology. And it's why it's so dangerous to, you know, there was this awful term that I railed against. It was so frustrating to see it under Obama's presidency. The US State Department officially adopted as their name for challenging this problem, they adopted the term Al-Qaeda inspired extremism. Of course, it isn't Al-Qaeda that it inspired extremism. It's extremism that inspired Al-Qaeda. And it's for the purposes of political correctness, you adopt this term in the State Department officially that we're fighting, across the world, we are fighting Al-Qaeda-inspired extremism. My former organization, Hizb ut-Tahrir, a caliphate espousing organization that believes in their ideal caliphate, that gays should be killed, adulteresses should be stoned to death, they were there before Al-Qaeda. And this ideology has been there before Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was one of a long line of groups that came as a result of the Islamist ideology. And we've got to start focusing on the ideology itself, not the physical groups that spring up from it. Because they can change their name.
As you point out, there's another layer to the ideology that is even more well subscribed, that presents social and political problems. So you know, as you said, there are conservative Muslims who don't support Al-Qaeda. They're not jihadists. They would honestly say, bin Laden doesn't represent my brand of Islam, but these are still people who will say that homosexuals should be killed.
That's right.
So it's like there's the apparent allies against, quote, extremism can still be people with religiously mandated social attitudes that just cannot be assimilated in cosmopolitan societies. So people who are, and I mean, worse than Al-Qaeda inspired extremism, there's just this notion that on the left, and this came out of Obama's mouth and it came out of Clinton's mouth, and it's largely why she wasn't president. It's just generic extremism, right? So that, like, in the same sentence that you have to worry about the caliphate, you have to talk about abortion doctors being killed in the U.S. once every 15 years.
So, of course, you remember because President Obama refused to use the word Islamist extremism.
Yes.
Of course, Trump has the other problem. He thinks that by, like Rumpelstiltskin, by repeating it enough, you've solved the problem. You know, but actually, one of the elements in which he was correctly critical of Obama was, and I was at the time vocally critical of Obama's reluctance to use the word Islamist extremism. And we've got no problem when we talk about, when we talk about white supremacist ideology, we don't mean that all white people are supremacists. You know, what we're doing here is actually attributing specifically what the ideology is and believes in, white supremacy. Likewise, Islamist, it's important so we can identify that ideology, still while not calling it Islam. Right? So we're still giving a bit of a leeway there for everybody else, all the other Muslims. But to call it Islamist extremism is to recognize that it's an offshoot of Islam. It's a manifestation, extreme or otherwise, of Islam. And thereby we are acknowledging that its justifications are in Islamic scripture, as well as, of course, a multiplicity of other causes, grievances and what have you. But we cannot ignore that it also rests on justifications that are derived from the Islamic scripture. I mean, I can cite for the Arabic that tells you in the Quran itself to cut the hand of the thief or to lash the adulterer. These are, or I quote the hadith or the saying of the Prophet that says, kill the person that changes their religion. This is scripture. And so, of course, there are other factors involved as well. But one of the factors that gives rise to this is the unreformed scripture that these extremists cite. And so we have to acknowledge that Islam has a role to play. I often say that, because, again, under the Obama presidency, it was frustrating that the common refrain was to say that Islam, this has nothing to do with Islam. It's as absurd as arguing that the Spanish Inquisition had nothing to do with Catholicism.
He went even further at one point, didn't he? At one point say that not only does this have nothing to do with Islam, this has less to do with Islam than any other religion. Something it was just, he bent over backwards. And
it's like saying the Crusades have nothing to do with Christianity,